So hello and welcome to this video on hacking tubes to do interesting things, making the most of distortion, and VCA mixing patch tips for doing some interesting and weird and wonderful things in a modular system. And we're going to do this while demoing the new Rabbit Hole and Curiouser modules from Apollo View. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. This video is sponsored by Apollo View. Rabbit Hole is a dual VCA summing mixer that also has a dual filter tone stack, clipping stages, drive stages and tube stages that can work as a nice heavy distortion or a more warm and subtle output stage for any audio you'd like to pass through it. Curiouser is a dual VCA, and both Curiouser and Rabbit Hole's VCAs are based on Tom Wiltshire's vintage VCA designs. So let's run down the controls and the signal flow of Rabbit Hole and Curiouser. We start with two inputs, A and B, with manual gain controls. As these are VCAs, they also have CV controls with attenuators to change the behaviour of those inputs. This will split and go to the dry side of this mix control, which we'll come back to later. As these are summed together, they also hit this drive stage before they hit the tube, with the tube bias control adjusting the biasing around pin 3 of that tube there, and this late switch will change the grounding, and this will start to play around with pin 8 on that tube too. This tube outputs into a tone stack with a high pass and a low pass filter, and this blends between them as a tone control, and we have CV over tone, again with an attenuator. All of this then hits this mix stage where we have the summed input VCAs on the dry side and all the distortion and tone stack on the other side. This then hits off with their head, which is an LED clipper, nicely bringing in these red LEDs behind the panel here, and that goes to the output, which again has an attenuator. There's an inbuilt feedback path with feedback amount and feedback switch, and again there's CV control over feedback with an attenuator. Curiouser can be used independently as a dual VCA with an input and a manual level, CV input and attenuator for that CV depth control, and a direct out. These will sum together and mix together as a dual mixing VCA if you don't patch out from there, and when this is expanding into Rabbit Hole, you can choose if these are just direct outs or blending in with the inputs on Rabbit Hole, and you can keep expanding these to build a 6-input summing mixer, as I have here, CV VCA summing mixer with nice kind of tube and warmth on the output there. You can use them independently, and you can keep chaining these and build as big of a Rabbit Hole Curiouser modular system as you like. So there's lots of patches in this video, and you can skip around on screen. The timing index is there and in the description if you'd just like to head into hearing these modules. Let's dive in. So here we're going to look at animated oscillator drones. And I say animated oscillator as this is the oscillator coming in, generate 3 here, it's the green trace on data, and I'm modulating its various waveform and harmonic levels. Losing feedback and off with their head, let's just go fully wet, just explore distorting an animated wave. This could just as easily be something like a smoothly morphing wavetable. there's a kind of subtle fattening and warming that works really well with that rounder tube and a little bit less drive. Let's push this and really clip it, add the off with the head. Let's bring in some feedback. I'm sure we'll get some weird interactions between these animating points of the wave. And there she goes. Say some audio rate modulation. And that tone control making all the difference there. So in this patch we're going to explore two things. First and foremost, crossfading between two inputs, which is a really nice feature of having VCAs and attenuating CV inputs, and stepped modulation. Now remove the modulation, strip this back, and let's first explore this crossfader patch. So I have two inputs here to rabbit hole. The first being a droning oscillator there on B, just a triangle wave, and a synced oscillator playing an arpeggiator pattern. Now we know that we can plug in modulation to the CV and fade sounds in and out. If we actually use them inverted, one inverted against the other, and I'll do this as extreme as possible here, this is the same LFO that will make one side rise in volume while the other side falls. And you can hear we're crossfading between these two inputs. We're now modulating these tonal characteristics quite heavily, and we're crossfading between the droning oscillator and the arpeggiating one. Because I'm modulating feedback here, and I've inverted the output, this behaviour will change as I actually bring the level back round positively. The output routing back to an input is what the feedback is, so whether we invert that or not makes a big difference. Now here I'm using Rabbit Hole like a quad VCA that mixes, like a 4-stage mixer for the output of this system, and one that I can modulate. Have 4 inputs and 4 CVs here, fading in and out the sound. But in this patch we're also going to look at some clever CV normalisations that allow us to manipulate these 4 sounds in interesting ways. Now pulling the CV out, my 4 inputs are triangle waves tuned to the notes of a chord. The root, the 5th, the minor 7, and the minor 3rd. We can look at modulating all of these sounds from a single CV source. If I plug in an LFO here to CVA and turn it up, we can hear that sound swelling in and out, but CVA will normalise to CVB, and it will also normalise through this connection into Curiouser to these CVs too. So if I turn them all up with positive modulation here, all 4 inputs are swelling in and out. The levels are just pushing up a little bit into this kind of grit of the tube. But where this gets interesting is if we start to invert some of the behaviours. So say the 2nd and 4th inputs. It's now swaying between 2 chord tones, the root and the 7th, and the 5th and the 3rd. If we start to then modulate all of these individually, we can create this lovely swelling of this chord tone, taking advantage of some slightly mixed in tube warmth and Rabbit Hole is the output of this patch. Nothing else is going on. So here we'll look at patching a compressor with a VCA. We're also going to have some nice parallel saturation here too. So let's start with those drums. This is my rough drum mix, no modulation, and the Rabbit Hole mix there is dry. Now I have an envelope follower following the amplitude, the shape of this drum sound, and we can duck that VCA while it's open. So if you really listen around the kick and snare there, you'll hopefully hear these compressed beats. I can then add a touch of a nice warmth and saturation from Rabbit Hole. Nice crunchy, chunky kind of analog drum sound. If I go the other way and close the VCA, but then use the envelope follower to open it, we'll get an expander. As the peaks of those drums are opening themselves through the VCA, letting their own level through, quickly coming down as those sounds decay. Really tightens everything up. So this is compressed. This is expanded. Now here's my bass sound, which comes into the bottom channel of Curiouser, and we're doing a sidechain ducking technique against the kick drum. If I remove that ducking, the sound just comes straight through. And I'm simply triggering an envelope, which is this one to the top right of the screen there, every time the kick drum plays. So if I was to bring my drum sound back in and add positive modulation from this envelope, you can hear the bass is now hitting when the kick drum does. But I want this to go the opposite way. I want it to duck when the kick drum hits. So I open the VCA and then use negative modulation. And you can hear that ducking out of the way. So here we're playing around really heavy distortion. I'm coming out of Rabbit Hole here into Curiouser and using the VCA to duck the signal. Here it is playing straight through. So here's my clean input, going fully wet here. I've got off with their head engaged for that extra clipping, tube up full, pushing the drive, and I'm modulating the CV of this, so more input gain to hit all these distortion stages, the mix and the tone, all being hit with an accent envelope. These are the same envelope that's going to the gain for the sub. So the sub and all the tonal changes are accented together. Bringing that main wave back in, and just adding in some sub unmodulated. The triangle sub there. You can just get all these great hard distortion sounds. Back against the kick, I'm being sidechained here, so it's ducking against the kick. So here I've made a really dynamic modulated drum mix from 6 different sources by expanding Rabbit Hole with 2 Curiouser modules. You can just keep chaining these with how they expand. So I could have another 2, another 4. I'm happy here with 6 though. I'm using the VCAs on Curiouser and the CV for the VCAs on the inputs on Rabbit Hole to modulate my drum sounds, giving me this dynamic pattern. Now I'm enjoying a little bit of this tube warmth and crunch on some already quite lo-fi analog drum sounds, so let's strip it back and go through the patch. So with all the CVs down, nothing here is happening, and I'll just go through the manual input gains to let you hear the sounds. So if I build up a mix of these, but because we have CV over them all, I thought why not make this dynamic and take advantage of what's on offer here. So turning down all the gains, Let's turn up the CVs that I have here. Nice dynamic patterns there. So as I unmute everything, we've got dynamically modulating 6 input mixing of these drums, and we could really push into this tube if we wanted. Quite like that muffled, just all out fuzz. Unlock the mystery of the secret wave folder. So if you're an Indiana patch hunter, mysterious wizard of the voltage, you can actually find some wave folding in Rabbit Hole. Have a sine wave coming in, green trace there is the input, blue trace is the out, and as I mix across, just on the edge of bringing that positive peak back down like a wave folder. This sine is a little low level, so you may not need as much gain or drive, for example, with your oscillators. You can see that very much the positive part of this wave kinks back down like a wave folder. If I invert my output here, or change its behaviour on this attenuator, then it's the negative part of the wave that starts to fold back up, again, much like a wave folder. With that under some basic LFO modulation, we can see how tone will drastically alter this wave shape. So here I'm using Rabbit Hole as a subharmonics generator. I have a clean part playing here, and this is what's coming out of Rabbit Hole. Relative to the input if I blend them together. And those subharmonics are blending in and working to give us sub-octaves, almost a counter bass line. I mean, listen there, with literally just changing the gain, I get a whole different bass line. I'm using Curiouser here to blend my separate signals, because there's feedback routing the output back into Rabbit Hole. I can't blend my dry back in there, I need to be feeding back Rabbit Hole on itself. So I'm using Curiouser with the switches down to blend the sound out into my mixer and record with this separate to Rabbit Hole. This is now my triangle input wave. Very simple, static, no sequencing, no effects. This is the output of Rabbit Hole, which is taking that sine wave, just a split copy on that cable there. And you can see in here, it's a subharmonic. And as I bring the gain up, it will lock back in, same tuning but distorted in a different wave shape. But as I bring the gain down, so you can imagine modulating gain there, you could actually start sequencing subharmonics. So I've set a patch up here with 2 different envelopes playing. My input sound, and it's this triangle again that's going into Rabbit Hole, and here's the output of Rabbit Hole with a different envelope controlling when that sound comes on and off. And that works as a nice dual layer patch with the triangle playing more regularly than the Rabbit Hole here. But let's drop that gain again and start descending into some subharmonics on Rabbit Hole. really nice kind of bouncy counter melody bassline thing going on here. That's going to change again. It's not the same sequence that's coming in, but it's relative to it. It's interesting. It's these different synced subharmonics against the input. So set rabbit hole as shown and play around with some subharmonics. So here's a nice kind of hazy, shoegazy type patch that is stereo, parallel distortion, tremolo, aliasing style downsampling, and modulation of some saturation. I'll pull it down and we'll build the patch back up again. So this is my dry input sound. I'm modulating the gains with two different unsynced LFOs. So there's just a bit of gain going to be adjusted on these VCAs on the way into the distortion. And then adding in this idea of tremolo, this pulsing, and it's the yellow trace here on data, into the CV mix. And then additionally, I'm using the Curious of VCAs here for some added attenuation. I've got a highly tuned oscillator here that I'm going to bring in to modulate the tone at audio rate. The final addition to this patch was to get this aliasing tone moving, and because everything here has attenuverters, I'm going to bring the same LFO into CV modulate this high pitch sound. This one just to be really clear. And with the attenuverter up positive on this side and inverting on that side, as this high pitched tone comes in on one side, it will go down on the other, and we have this swaying aliased top end tone. So saturation in parallel, pulsing tremolo, modulation over the gain coming in, nice aliasing type tone. Let's add that reverb back in on the end of the patch. So as rabbit hole will feedback, we can actually make this tube oscillate and turn it into an oscillator. Have the settings as seen here on screen if you'd like to copy them, flicking in feedback. And all the controls become really interactive for this tube oscillation. Now we can get rabbit hole to track volt per octave around an octave or two. And in order to get that tracking, I'd first use a tuner. I'm going to use data here and tune to a note that I've got as a reference point. So there I can see I'm just slightly sharp of G2. I'm then going to take a CV sequence that will simply go up an octave and scale the amount of CV on the CV tone. So now I have a sequence that's simply bouncing around 0 volts and a volt to go up an octave. I fine-tune this CV tone to try and make that higher note a G3, an octave above where I am. And with some very fine-tuning, just gently touching that trimmer there, you can see we're bouncing from the default tuning set with these interactive controls at G2. It's bouncing up to an octave. If I then add some other notes to this pattern, it will track roughly volt per octave. And here's a couple of examples of volt per octave sequences controlling the rabbit hole as if it's an oscillator. So continuing with feedback and oscillation, we can turn this into an LFO. We've seen it as an audio rate oscillator that will track fairly well over an octave or two, but here I've got the settings tuned to give me this low LFO. It's modulating a wave folder, a high pass filter and a low pass filter, and all of the modulation is from Rabbit Hole. You can hear this patch is otherwise droning. So with feedback up and the knobs set as they are here on screen, we get some lower sub-audio LFOs. Now we can wave shape by turning on off with their head. More square-like, but not quite square wave. And you can maybe see in here we've got these kind of little kind of gurgles of feedback in between. And if we go to turn on the lit, which changes that pin setting of the grounding around the tube, it really cleans up this modulation shape. Both when off with their head is on, and when it's off. Now we know that these controls are interactive, and if we start modulating them, we can start playing around with modulating this oscillating tube. That's a pretty mad LFO, it's good fun. So here we're exploring AM synthesis, audio rate modulation of amplitude of a VCA, and I have dynamic modulated modulation modulating the VCA. Now let's strip this patch right back and start from the beginning. So this is a low pitch triangle wave coming in to Rabbit Hole, and I'm using Curiouser independently with this blue trace here, this sine wave, at the minute with no modulation, that's coming in to modulate the VCA. As I raise its level, we'll see the yellow trace here, the output change, and you'll hear the effect of this AM synthesis. As I start to change the tuning of this audio rate modulator in Curiouser here, so some really interesting tones. Now if I use the Curiouser VCA with an envelope to bring in and out this modulation, much like me turning that knob there, I'm imparting this oscillator's tone on the amplitude of this one. Now if I get both my carrier, this triangle wave, and my modulator here following the same pitch sequence, with the addition of AM, so low end wobbling sub pressure is always an exciting thing. And here we have some nice low end coming from a triangle wave through Rabbit Hole, being thrown around by some LFOs for some nice wobby wobbles. I sound like Mr. Blobby. And let's remove the other sounds that are going on and just listen to this processed triangle wave. Take simple waves, throw them into some distortion, just modulate it around freely, or you could be much more in sync and kind of consciously patching than me throwing random LFOs in, but get some subs moving. Nice thick low end from this distortion. I'm sure most of you got the Alice in Wonderland reference with going down the rabbit hole, feeling curiouser and curiouser, being late, off with their heads. And if you've got this far in the video and you've got that reference, let me know your favourite character from Alice in Wonderland in the comments section. I'm sure that's going to weird people out that don't watch to the end of the video. All the links down below. You can support my work down below as well, either with affiliate links or Patreon support, which will gain access to lots of exclusive member benefits. That's it for now. See you next time. Bye.